Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by the tall and bearded Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you?
Well, thank you, Nicholas. How's it?
And I'm also, of course, joined by the intellectual and unbearded Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, how are you?
How's it, Nicholas? I think this is my first time this year on the Daily Friend, so happy New Year to all the viewers. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you with us.
Very good. How's it, Bheki? And can we also say how's it to the friendly octopus?
Yeah, for sure.
Does he have a name?
No, he doesn't have a name yet, but I think I'm going to have him on the Thursday shows, so it could be the Thursday show octopus. But anyway, for those listening on audio only, do check us out on YouTube just to see what we're talking about, because you might be rather confused otherwise. Anyway, let's get into it. And the first thing is, immigration's been in the news a lot this week. We talked about it a little bit yesterday with the EFF going around inspecting businesses with regards to them employing too many foreigners. I think the EFF said that there was an Ocean Basket they went to where out of something like 40 employees, only 8 were South Africans. And this was very not good. I'm somewhat confused as to when a shakedown became legal, but anyway. And Mmusi Maimane, who's a character who we have poured a lot of scorn on, and normally seems to only get into the news these days through social media, has actually said something that I think is very much worth thinking about and bringing into the conversation about immigration. So Mmusi Maimane on Twitter weighed in on the immigration debate. He said, the immigration challenges that we are facing are because the SA government has enabled a brutal and corrupt regime to terrorize its citizens for 42 years. While there is tyranny in our neighborhood, we will not be able to deal with the challenges of immigration. He went on to say that from the Gukurahundi massacres in Zimbabwe to this very date, the effects of Mugabe, Mnangagwa eras have been a mass exodus. And I think this is a point that's very worth making. And I know some people made it back in the Bheki era when, we had that whole period of, quiet diplomacy?
Silent diplomacy.
Silent diplomacy, that was it. Where Bheki was sort of playing nice with ZANU-PF, and he tried to set up that kind of coalition agreement between the MDC and ZANU-PF, which ultimately, of course, did not resolve Zimbabwe's problems. And it is definitely worth saying, I think, that South Africa's sort of poor foreign policy has probably contributed to our immigration crisis. The fact that we have so many people coming across the border here, particularly from Zimbabwe, is definitely due to the failure of that state. And one wonders whether if South Africa had played a more positive role in trying to stabilize Zimbabwe, that there wouldn't be so many Zimbabweans who needed to come to South Africa for economic opportunity. So, Gabriel, what's your thought on that thesis? Do you think that our policy to Zimbabwe has made things worse in terms of the number of immigrants coming here?
Yeah, I really do. I think that it's worth... Look, here's what that could sound like, which is silly. Sometimes when discussing the Middle East, people would eventually get to the point where they would say things like, the reason that the Twin Towers were attacked was because America was so nasty and it invaded Afghanistan. And it's like, no, let's get the cause and effect right. Let's be serious. So sometimes there can be a tendency to just blame your own government and your own administration because they're our guys, and that can really cloud a good analysis of foreign policy and immigration. But in this case, it really is very different. We had such asymmetries with regards to Zimbabwe. I thought it was quite nicely captured. It might have been, I can't remember who said it, but when Nelson Mandela was released from prison and first arrived at a convention that Mugabe was at, the line was, there was Mugabe, the star of Southern African politics. But now the sun has come out. truly South Africa was more majestic, more beloved. Its economy, an order of magnitude larger, its population, its infrastructure, everything just we had a lot going for us. We had a lot of these asymmetries matter in terms of hard power and soft power, in terms of the kind of influence that we could exert. So it's my claim that it was well within Bheki's power at the time to exert an influence that would have curtailed the worst in Zimbabwe. And the final point there is just to notice that while the land invasions and de facto expropriation without compensation, in fact, expropriation without compensation, which happened and then the government tried to catch up by passing laws to affirm it, that started in 2000, basically, circa 2000. And that Zimbabwe continued to carry on plowing through the basement, through the floor, then through basement level 1, then through basement level 2. Hyperinflation only really kicked in, if I'm right, in the mid-2000s. So while we couldn't have stopped what happened in 2000 from happening, we could have got them to turn around much sooner. The failure to do that is partly what resulted in Murambatsvina, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which comes in the late 2000s, which is the second sort of sweep up, Gukurahundi style attempt at putting down dissent. And it's really then when the South African Migration Project, SAMP, run from the University of Toronto, which has the best data on immigration from Zimbabwe. It's really around then that you see the hugest influx of Zimbabwean immigrants, and ever since then it's sustained. So in that intervening 7 years, there was room for us to do something, and we did nothing, excepting champion effectively race solidarity. The idea that black leaders shouldn't be criticizing black leaders in public, I think, was the argument for silent diplomacy, and it had very detrimental effects on Zimbabwe. And yeah, I think Maimane's right. It's having some detrimental effects on us.
Bheki, you were talking to me earlier about having some perspective on our position in Africa. So firstly, your thoughts on the immigration stuff, and why don't you tell us a little bit about what you were saying to me earlier?
I think there's Nick, there's a hard lesson what's going on in Zimbabwe there. And I 100% agree with Gabriel, as well as what Mmusi Maimane said recently, actually. If you look at other African countries, a lot of basic institutions have been devalued. Gabriel touched upon property rights, for example, being one of them, as well as the purchasing power of currency in some of these African countries, like Zimbabwe, has been absolutely decimated. Now, a lot of South Africans like to draw, or a lot of analysts as well, like to draw the comparison between South Africa and that of Zimbabwe and say South Africa is following the same path as Zimbabwe, which in many regards is, but we have to say that South Africa has very strong institutions currently, even though they're being devalued through expropriation of property or compensation, but we're still very much better than what Zimbabwe is. Now, when it comes to failing states, people then, when they are not able to vote through the ballot box, they then vote through their feet by immigrating. And that's exactly what has led to a large influx of Zimbabweans coming to South Africa to seek for economic opportunities. And the lesson there, Nick, is that we need to stop the dilutions of basic institutions in South Africa. Like, for example, expropriation of property or compensation, like the NHI, like the devaluation of the currency, for example. Yesterday, in fact, I was talking to a Bolt driver who came from Nigeria, and he was like quite shocked that people, South Africans, could go on radio and say that the South African government is talking BS, is doing a lot of nonsense, is stupid, and so forth. And he said where he comes from, if he said that in a public square, you would be planning your funeral in the next 2 hours or so forth. So there's definitely a lot of things to be grateful for in the country, but there's also things that we need to hold a firm line on.
Yeah, I think that's always worth bearing in mind, is that while South Africa has many problems and while much of our situation is getting worse, we do still have the ability to have a Daily Friend show without having to record from a secret bunker location somewhere out in the woods. And we don't have to really worry that the police are going to knock down on our doors and drag us away, at least not yet. When that day comes, we'll let you know. Gabriel, any final thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys covered this yesterday, but I just think that this is well captured by our cartoonist in the Daily Friend. the contradiction in Julius Malema's line. And in particular, I just want to draw attention to a media briefing that I saw him deliver towards the end of last year, where he was so emphatic that he said, I will never criticize another black person, especially a black person who's come from Africa to seek work here across the border, because those borders are a colonial construct designed to divide us and conquer us thereby. And the only way that we can succeed is to unite as Black Africans together to rise up. And if you ever find me criticizing Black Africans for immigrating here, then I will resign. And if I don't resign, the party must remove me. He was answering this in answer to a question about whether he was a bit of a tyrant in ruling his party. I kid you not. I have the recording.
Well, as the EFF said yesterday, don't let the enemy confuse you. We're there to help our foreign brothers from other African countries. You know, by exposing that the companies are hiring too many of them, I'm not quite sure how this is supposed to work.
And the other thing is, just by the way, you know, one of the restaurants, like the restaurateur said in Midrand, that Julius has been coming there for 15 years. He's like one of his top clients. He's like always ordering from the top shelf. So I wonder.
Socialism.
You think they gave him some bad oysters and that's why he showed up?
I don't know, but you know, it does make you wonder. Maybe it is something petty like that has triggered this. Anyway, I mean, it is very serious with the xenophobic pogroms that we've had since 2008, with the clicks attacks that were ordered by Malema. You know, we're laughing about it, but it is serious.
This is a point that I often want to make. You know, we talk often about, you know, where a lot of people whisper in South Africa, I know we're headed for some kind of great racial conflagration where, you know, white and black are going to fight each other in the streets and all that kind of thing. And I think that's not the real source of potential violence in this country. We've already seen what the real source is, and that's xenophobia. And it's a very big problem. And I don't think our political parties have really figured out how to deal with it yet. In fact, if anything, they've just started to encourage it recently.
Right. So that's exciting. That is a real and disturbing change. So there are I think the two sources of violence. Race relations are a major problem if you've got a PhD and you write laws to get in the way of business. Then race is very exciting. But the things that are very exciting on the streets, the blood on the street stuff, it's xenophobia, it's also property rights stuff. There are makers and there are breakers. There are some people who believe what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. Let's trade for it voluntarily in a win-win kind of way. There are other people who believe property is theft. So if you've got something, it means you're a thief. And if I steal something, that means I'm a better entrepreneur than you are. And that is a very serious divide. You can also call it the divide between a Marxist and a free marketeer. And people don't often use those words for themselves, a criminal or a citizen. But I think that's a very fundamental divide. And that's what we saw in the riots last year. And I think the next riot, for me, the question is the next riot going to be a xenophobic thing or a property rights thing?
I think that's a very good point. All right, let us move on to our next story. And Bheki, your beat is pretty much economics. That's what you're really keen on. You wanted to talk about some of the causes and consequences of inflation in SA. Inflation seems to be going up in many countries around the world. What do you have to say about it?
Yeah, Nick, quite recently, Stats SA published consumer inflation here in the country, which is now at 5.9%, above the midpoint target set by the South African Reserve Bank of 4.5%. It is stated that what has driven the inflation to be higher is due to transport costs, which has largely due to the increase in the oil price. In fact, if you were to look at the oil price since last year, March to now, it has increased by 60%. So that has put an upward pressure on inflation levels, not only here in South Africa, but as well as around the world. I mean, the US, for example, is facing near 40-year high elevated price levels. So that is extremely bad. And inflation is essentially an invisible tax on ordinary citizens, even in South African citizens, any citizens around the world. It dilutes the purchasing power of them. If you can think about it as an image, you can think about your wallet. In your wallet, there's a little bit of notes and so forth. And each time you see inflation rising, your wallet gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And unfortunately, the large proportion of people that are impacted by that are largely the poor South Africans that are not hedged against inflation, like how wealthy individuals are by having investing in inflation hedged assets. Now, the implications for this here, Nick, is that the South African Reserve Bank is closely looking at this, looking at these high inflation levels, which would lead them to increase interest rates in future. And that is important because if you increase interest rates, you're sort of slowing down the people borrowing money, business borrowing money and lending and so forth. So there's be a slowdown of economic activity. In the South African context, if you match that with hostile policies over the past 10 years, you will unfortunately land up with a situation where you have low economic performance. In fact, it's quite likely that this year's economic performance could be lower than last year. And last year, that was largely due to the low base effect. So there are extremely large implications for this. And if I may also touch on this, is that also in the US, I've seen that the Fed chair there has also mentioned that they will start hiking interest rates, which would lead to the dollar strengthening and leading to weaker commodity prices. Now, that is very unfortunate for South Africa because predominantly our exports are made up of commodities, and that has essentially been holding up the rand for the past 2 years and has led to a better than expected revenue collection by the South African government. So this year looks like it's going to be a year of increase in interest rates, a stronger dollar, a weaker rand, unfortunately, as well as depleting government revenues, which has large implications, as well as weak South African economic performance.
Gabriel, anything to add? Historically, I think we've seen that inflation does actually tend to have quite powerful political effects beyond just its economic effects because people really do feel it. What do you have to add to what Bheki just said?
Yeah, I think Bheki put that really well. It's very deep and it's both deep and broad, right? It kind of affects everyone and it affects them. It impresses people when they see my salary is kind of stuck here, or the profits I'm able to extract are stuck here, but the cost of goods and services that I have to lay out are going up. So I think maybe just a small shout out for the thought that there are various theories about what causes inflation. And a standard sort of script that was written in the US in the 1960s and 70s, like in advance of their worst inflation run since the war, was, first they're going to say that it's just very temporary. Then they're going to say, okay, it is sticking around, but it's because of some supply chain mismanagement. Then they're going to say it's because of greed. And then society will collapse before they admit that the cause of inflation is that you've had the same amount of goods and services, but more money in the system. And if you increase the money, but you have the same amount of goods and services, then each buck is going to buy you less. Okay, and that is more or less vindicated by everyone since Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize on that point. So why does that matter in South Africa's context? Well, it matters in South Africa's context because we have had the greatest deficits basically on record. And when the government is borrowing money, it basically, and it's got two options. It can quickly raise taxes to pay that back. South Africa's government doesn't have the ability to pay taxes, to raise taxes, because it's already kind of pushed it to the hilt. So it's effectively inventing money, increasing the money supply. So that's a problem. The problem internationally is that central banks around the world have been doing the same thing. The difference is, as Bheki said, it's not a fair world. So, when America pushes up its interest rates a point or two, 25 basis points. I mean, the Fed was promising that they were going to push it up 25 basis points every quarter for the next 4 quarters, something like that. That is going to hugely attack the rand. If we push up our interest rates a little bit, it's not going to have nearly the same effect. And part of that is because the market has already determined how risky we are compared to how risky the US is and Europe. In Europe and the US, you almost have to pay the government to borrow their money. In South Africa, our government, our taxpayers, actually, you, me, Bheki, all of us, we have to pay 10% effectively to get people to borrow our bonds, to borrow our sovereign debt. So 10% versus about 0, 1, sometimes negative. That's because we are risky. That's because people are like, are you going to be around next year? Are you going to have a command council that decides to change the rules of the game? Are you going to have, what was it? Not prescribed assets, peri monetary easing, or whatever that thing was. Are you gonna, we had our Minister of Minerals shout at the Australians for not mining something that doesn't exist. We have expropriation without compensation coming through the expropriation bill. We've got the NHI threatening to chase away doctors and nurses, which will chase away the middle class. For all of these reasons, our money, because they're worried that we won't pay it back, because the country might go kaput. There's like a 10% chance of that. You could think of it as like a 10% chance of that, according to the markets. Whereas America, it's like a 0% chance. And so we're all kind of in the same boat, excepting South Africa is sort of off the edge of the boat, or it's like holding onto the oar, getting its face rubbed in the water and then lifted up and rubbed in the water through these commodity cycles, through these inflation cycles. We kind of lose on both ends sometimes. And the only way to get out of it is a combination of fiscal discipline, monetary discipline, and a cutting of red tape that allows our great potential to be untapped. I mean, we could have, as John Endres, our CEO, has pointed out, we could really hit 5% growth for 5 years in a row in 5 years, if we just followed 5 simple steps.
555 sounds like the basis of a political platform. Any final thoughts, Bheki?
Yeah, just something that Gabriel touched on, which is quite relevant, is the masking of where inflation comes from, which essentially comes from the printing of money. Like, for example, there's been reports of supply shortages. Even The Economist, if you can correct me there, Gabriel, said it caught them by surprise, actually, which I find quite amazing.
It's amazing.
It's unbelievable.
It would not have caught anyone at The Economist by surprise in the 1990s. Like, they already could see it coming, but the guys in 2021 couldn't see it coming, despite what the Bank of England and the Fed and the ECB
Exactly. I mean, the quantum of stimulus that was pumped in respective economies in predominantly Western countries is absolutely unbelievable. I've never seen such money printing in my life. And not only that, but now what I'm seeing right now is that the certain governments, for example, I've seen signals from the Biden administration actually blaming meat packaging industries in the US for the increase in meat prices, which is what Gabriel has suggested.
Greed. Then you blame it on greed.
Exactly, on greed. I think that's a dangerous thing. And now we're seeing certain economists, like I've seen from The Guardian, suggesting that the way to do this is to implement price controls, which is the surest way to nationalization of certain industries, because you would need to then price control your suppliers, because they would then not supply if it's not profitable, because you've essentially put a price ceiling. And so you have to control them and on and on and on. And all the factors that go into it. Exactly.
And what do you create? A black market.
Exactly.
And how good are we at that? The cigarette black market.
It is worth pointing out, though, that even pretty left-wing economists who are very in favor of printing money said, whoa, price controls, hold on, what are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
And as for the political endurance of the Biden administration, I just saw a news story today that the Associated Press says that Biden's approval rating is down to 43%, and only 28% of Americans want him to run for re-election in 2024, including less than half of Democrats, which is, of course, his own party. So,
dude, and that's what you were saying about inflation has a very strange habit of making people very irritated with whoever's in charge. Now, the unfortunate thing is sometimes you also then sit with inflation that you didn't create. You can take over. But anyway, which is kind of Biden's situation. Part of it was created by Trump. Quite a large part of it.
Well, it's been American policies since what? At least Bush. to just kind of keep ramping up the money printing. So this is a
bipartisan
very
nightmare
long,
in the US.
Yeah, no, exactly. Anyway, okay.
Look, let's make it clear. Biden did increase the debt by
a lot.
Sort of more than the last few together. he's not innocent of this.
Yeah, it's very much, it's a little bit like the sunk cost fallacy. It's like, oh, come on, guys, I can print like 10 times as much because he printed 10 times as much and he printed 10 times as much. It's a lot of, it's just because all your friends are doing drugs doesn't mean you should. Anyway, let's move on, I think, to our last story today. And this is about the ongoing public debate around Cadre deployment. So Thuli Madonsela attended a DA event recently where they were talking about state capture and the state capture situation. And she said, referring to the DA here, some of your colleagues have referred to Cadre deployment as a major problem. My preliminary conclusion as public protector was that what we had seen was not Cadre deployment, but hijack. She went on to say, if you look at China as a country, they have Cadre deployment. What does that mean? It means they deploy the best people in their party. People who've been trained in statecraft, the best of them. That's why China has become a global giant. It's because of Cadre deployment. What I'm saying is that state capture was about the family of former President Zuma having gone into business with the Gupta family and the power given to Zuma by the people of SA being hijacked and repurposed to advance the business interests of these two families. Zilla also then went on to say that she thought that National Party Cadre deployment wasn't good, but it had been more effective than ANC Cadre deployment. And later said all Cadre deployment is wrong. Anyway, so there's now been allegations against by the ANC, and we covered this on the show, I think, at the beginning of the week, that the DA does Cadre deployment. Gabriel, do you want to just weigh in here?
Dude, I think this is hilarious.
A good thing or a bad thing?
Well, no, I mean, I love this. Like, the thing is, firstly, Cadre deployment's a bad thing, but secondly, you do have to point out that the ANC is not even good at doing a bad thing, right? So this is where Madonsela and Zilla agree. They're like, there's China, there's the Nationalist Party of Apartheid, and then there's the ANC doing the bad thing even worse than those other two terrible regimes. I guess it's a sign of how desperate we are to like get these oaks to wake up and stop hurting us and stop eating the money that we need to not fall like water into the sand. We need to keep it in the system so people can compete for it, grow it, water the tree, give us a chance. Anyway, in political science terms, it is the case that the great tension, once you have an administrative state, and an administrative state means it's no longer just a white night watchman state, right? So the government starts out with just the police, the army, the tax collectors you need to get the police and the army, and the courts that have to decide when two people come to the police and they say, you stole my stuff, he says, you stole my stuff. Okay, those are the four things that you need. You get an administrative state, they start watching over the roads and the water and the schools and the hospitals and all kinds of things. And by the way, a lot of this is very good. But once you've got an administrative state, then you need careerists. You need people that are going to stay in those positions, but you need those positions to be somewhat sensitive to political change. Because if you still had people who who genuinely did have an apartheid mentality, who, if they saw the three of us, would decide who stands at the back of the queue on the basis of how they look, then that civil service wouldn't be running properly. So things must change sensitive to politics, but if they change too much sensitive to politics, you've got unelected officials who cronies who then gunk up everything. So this is a basic tension, and it's kind of, many trees are cut down to make the paper for the poll size to write about it. The simple point is, there are better and worse ways of doing it. You kind of want to do as little political point as much as you can and as much merit as you can. And right now we're doing exactly the opposite. It's official policy. And read the Zondo report, page 976, where Zondo says the systemic analysis of state capture is bad, BEE. And basically all of BEE is bad. He says
is it 976 or 700?
796.
There we go. All right. Bheki, we don't have a lot of time left. In 30 seconds or so, your thoughts?
Yeah, just to say that I agree with Gabriel. I mean, the simple point is that if you, what's key to note here is that the ANC is simply unwilling to move away from cadre deployment, as well as what Gabriel said, bad BEE and so forth, which would lead to their continual decline in support. So that's truly unfortunate.
Indeed. But, we shall see. As we've been saying for the past couple of months, it does feel like political change of a sort is in the air in South Africa. So we have an interesting road to travel. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. We will see you next week on the Daily Friend Show. Thank you very much for watching. Please support the Institute of Race Relations. You can see on the banner behind me, 32823. SMS name to that and we'll sign you up as a friend. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Cheers.